I'll never forget that night. It was around midnight, and I was driving home after a long shift at the hospital. I worked as a nurse, and it had been a busy night in the ER. I was exhausted both physically and mentally. All I wanted to do was get home, have a hot shower, and fall into bed. As I drove down the empty road, my mind started to wander and think about the patients I'd seen that night. One man had come in with multiple stab wounds. Another was in a serious car accident. It was always draining to see so much pain and suffering. I turned up the radio, hoping the music would keep me awake during the drive and stop me from thinking about work. After about 20 minutes, I started to recognize the familiar landmarks that meant I was getting closer home. I turned onto my street and was relieved to see my house in the distance. But as I drove closer, something didn't seem right. The porch light that I always leave on wasn't illuminated. Then I noticed that the front door was slightly ajar. My heart started racing as panic set in. I knew I had definitely closed and locked the door before leaving for my shift. Gripping the steering wheel tightly, I pulled into the driveway and stopped the car. I didn't get out right away, too afraid of what might be inside waiting for me. My mind was running through every possible worst-case scenario. Was someone still inside? Were they waiting to attack me? I fumbled for my phone with shaky hands, ready to call 911. But then I noticed something else that sent a chill down my spine. The door to my garage was also open, and my car was missing from inside. Whoever was inside had clearly taken my car, but why leave the front door open, unless they were still here? My fight or flight response kicked in, and I slammed my foot on the gas, speeding out of the driveway as fast as I could. I didn't stop driving until I was a few miles away, parked on a well-lit street with houses close together. With my hands still trembling, I called the police and reported the break-in and stolen vehicle. 2 patrol cars arrived within minutes, their lights flashing in the dark. I recounted to the officers what had happened and what I saw when arriving home. They radioed in a description of my car to be on the lookout. One officer stayed with me to get more details, while the other did a sweep of the house, just in case the intruder was still lurking inside. After a thorough search, he reported back that the house appeared to be empty. Whoever was there was long gone, along with my car. I was advised not to return home until the crime scene unit had processed the house for evidence. The officers drove me to a nearby motel for the night, assuring me they would update me if they found any leads. But lying awake in the unfamiliar room, I couldn't stop replaying the scene in my head. The door left open, the car missing. It all felt so violating. Who did this, and what were their intentions? Were they just a common thief, or was there something more sinister at play? The next day, I checked out of the motel to meet with the detectives assigned to my case. They informed me no arrests had been made yet, and there were no solid leads on my stolen vehicle. I was frustrated by the lack of progress, but I knew these things took time. In the coming days and weeks, I constantly looked over my shoulder, paranoid someone was watching or following me. My sense of security had been shattered. A month went by with no new information. The detectives told me these types of cases often go cold without witnesses or evidence. I was starting to lose hope that I would ever feel safe in my own home again. Then late one night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard a loud bang come from downstairs. My heart leapt into my throat as adrenaline shot through my body. I slowly crept down the stairs, too terrified to call out or turn on any lights. Another noise came from the kitchen, like cabinets opening and closing. Gripping the banister so hard my knuckles turned white, I inched closer to the kitchen doorway. With my breathing rapid and shallow, I peered around the corner. At first, I didn't see anything out of place. Then a shadow moved in the darkness by the fridge. Without thinking, I lunged forward and flipped the switch. A man spun around, eyes wide with fear and surprise, dropping the bag of food he was holding. But it wasn't a stranger. It was the man from my ER, the one with the multiple stab wounds I had treated a month ago. In that moment, a chill went through my entire body as the truth became horrifyingly clear. This man must have followed me home from the hospital that night, watching and learning my routine. He was the one who broke in and stole my car, leaving clues to frighten me further. And now he had returned, but this time, he wasn't leaving without finishing what he started. I let out an ear-piercing scream just as he lunged at me, knife glinting in his hand. This was no coincidence. It was a killer's twisted game of cat and mouse that I was not meant to survive. I'll never forget that night. It's burned into my memory like a horrifying nightmare that just won't end. Looking back, all the signs were there, that something wasn't right, but in the moment, I was oblivious to the danger lurking so close. It was late fall. The leaves had mostly fallen from the trees, leaving the branches bare and eerie looking in the moonlight. My friend Laura had just moved to a new apartment a few miles outside of town and had invited me to help her unpack some boxes and get settled in. We spent the evening catching up over takeout and getting some of her things organized. Around 10 p.m. I realized how late it had gotten and that I needed to head home before it got too dark. Laura offered to walk out with me since her apartment was on the edge of the woods and the driveway wasn't well lit. We chatted and laughed as we carried the empty boxes to the large trash bins by her car. That's when I first noticed something was off. The woods behind the apartment seemed too quiet. Not a single owl hoot or insect noise could be heard. A shiver ran down my spine, but I brushed it off as tiredness. Laura gave me a hug goodbye and told me to drive safely. As I backed down the long gravel driveway, my high beams lit up a dark shape, darting behind a large tree at the edge of the woods. My heart leapt into my throat, but again I rationalized it must have been a deer or other animal. I waved one last time to Laura, who was watching from her porch, and started down the empty 2-lane road toward home, gripping the steering wheel tightly. The roads were deserted. Not a single other car passed me on the 15-minute drive. It was eerily silent except for my tires on the pavement in the darkness. A few miles from home, my car suddenly sputtered and died. I turned the key again, but it just clicked. The battery was dead. Perfect, I muttered to myself, grabbing my phone to call for help. But of course, there was no signal out here in the middle of nowhere. The surrounding woods seemed even darker and more menacing now that I was stranded. I popped the hood and got out with my small flashlight, hoping the problem was something simple I could fix myself. But the engine just sat there silently, giving no clues. Slightly panicking now, I slammed the hood shut and leaned against the warm metal, trying to decide my next move. It was then that I heard a faint crashing sound from the direction of Laura's house, like someone or something moving quickly through the underbrush. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as my mind raced through possible explanations. Was it an animal? But it sounded too big and too purposeful. I looked around desperately for any other cars, but the road stretched empty in both directions. A scream rose in my throat, but I held it back, not wanting to attract whatever was out there in the dark. I slid back into the driver's seat and locked the doors, heart pounding. Grabbing my phone again, I tried calling 911, but still nothing. A figure suddenly appeared at the edge of the woods, backlit eerily by the rising half-moon. It was unmistakably a person, walking with an unsteady gait toward my car. My breath caught in my chest as I scrambled under the steering column and began furiously trying to hotwire the car, hands shaking violently. Please start, I begged silently. The figure stopped just beside my door now, face shadowed, but body language radiating menace. I slammed my foot on the gas at the same moment sparks flew from under the dash and the engine roared to life, tires screeching. I whipped the car around and floored it, not daring to look back at whatever had been lurking in the woods. After what felt like eternity, but was probably just minutes, I slammed on the brakes in front of Laura's apartment, jumping out and racing up to her door with renewed panic. But she didn't answer my desperate knocking. With a sick feeling rising in my gut, I slowly pushed the unlocked door open and entered the dark living room, flashlight shaking in my trembling hand. What I found will haunt me for the rest of my days. The scene was one of utter devastation and carnage. Laura's mangled body lay in a pool of blood, sightless eyes staring blankly ahead. I fell to my knees, retching violently at the horror before me. Scrambling back out the door on hands and knees, I crawled, shaking, to my still-running car and peeled out. Finally finding cell service long enough to call 911 through hysterical sobs. The police arrived within minutes due to how isolated the area was, finding me catatonic in the driveway. After relaying the gruesome scene through choked tears, the realization hit me with bone-chilling clarity. The figure in the woods, the crashing I heard, it had been hunting us both that night. If my car hadn't died when it did, if I hadn't fixed it so quickly. I shuddered violently at the thought of what could have happened. To this day, I don't know if it was a madman or something even more sinister lurking in those woods that night. All I know is it was the closest call with a killer I hope I ever have. I'll never forget that night. It still haunts me to this day. It was a Friday, and I was home alone. My roommate was out of town for the weekend. I had just finished cooking dinner and was settling in for the night to binge. Watch Netflix. Around 9 p.m., I heard a knock at the door. Not expecting anyone, I slowly got up to check the peephole. There was no one there. I figured it must have been a kid playing a prank or something. A little while later, the knocking started again, this time more insistent. Once again, there was no one at the door when I looked through the peephole. By this point, I was starting to feel a little uneasy. I triple-checked that all the doors and windows were locked. I tried to rationalize it as just kids being silly, but I couldn't help the growing sense of unease in my gut. Around 10:30 p.m., I heard another knock. This time it sounded more like someone was pounding on the door forcefully. I froze in fear, not wanting to look through the peephole in case someone was waiting right there on the other side. I called out who's there, but received no response. After a few moments of silence, I slowly crept over to peek outside. Like the previous times, no one was there. By now, I was really spooked. I turned all the lights on in the house and grabbed a kitchen knife for protection, just in case. I tried calling my roommate for advice, but they didn't pick up. I paced around nervously, waiting for something, anything else to happen. Around midnight, I thought I heard a noise coming from the back door. I froze in fear, clutching the knife, too afraid to go investigate what the noise was. After a few minutes of silence, I slowly started creeping towards the back door, ready to defend myself. As I peered out the window, I screamed in shock. There was a man standing right there, staring back at me. He grinned menacingly and started banging furiously on the door. I stumbled backwards in a blind panic. That's when I heard the unmistakable sound of glass shattering in the living room. Someone had just broken in through the front window. I bolted in terror, desperately searching for somewhere to hide. I flung myself under the bed, covering my mouth to muffle my ragged breaths. My whole body shook in fear as I listened intently for any sounds of movement. Then I heard footsteps slowly making their way around the house, systematically searching each room. They were getting closer and closer to where I was hiding. I squeezed my eyes shut, clutching the knife so tight my knuckles turned white, waiting for the inevitable moment when they would find me. Then, just when the footsteps seemed right outside the bedroom, I heard a strange gurgling noise followed by a thud. Terrified but curious, I slowly emerged from my hiding spot, knife raised. I inched my way out to the hallway and spotted a trail of blood leading to the living room. With trembling hands, I followed the blood and gasped at the grisly scene before me. Lying dead on the floor was the man who had broken in. Standing over his body was another man, except this one was covered from head to toe in blood. He slowly turned to face me, and I screamed because it was my roommate standing there holding a blood-soaked knife. They explained that they had come home early to surprise me for the weekend, but arrived just in time to see the man breaking in. My roommate fought and killed the intruder to save my life. I was overcome with intense relief, but also confusion and shock at what had just transpired. My roommate called the police, who soon arrived to take statements and process the crime scene. It turned out the man who broke in had escaped from a local psychiatric facility and was off his medications. He had been targeting me for several days after seeing me in public. If not for my roommate's timely return, I have no doubt I would be dead right now. It still haunts me to think how close of a call it was with a killer that night. I'll be forever grateful to my brave roommate for saving my life. It was a cold winter night, and I was driving home from work late. The roads were empty, as most people were tucked away in their warm homes at this hour. I had the radio on low, just enough to break the eerie silence that comes with late-night drives. As I drove through a dark stretch of forest road, I began to feel uneasy. My senses were on high alert, even though everything around me appeared normal. I occasionally checked the rearview mirror, expecting to see a pair of headlights behind me. But each time I looked, the road behind me was dark and empty. I sped up in an attempt to quickly get past this unsettling stretch of road. That's when I spotted something in my headlights up ahead that made my blood run cold. There was a figure standing in the middle of the road, just standing there motionless. I slammed on the brakes and swerved to avoid hitting them. My car fishtailed on the icy road before coming to a stop at an angle across both lanes. My heart was pounding in my chest as I sat there trying to catch my breath. When I looked back to where I saw the person, they were gone. Vanished without a trace, like they were never even there. I sat in my car shaking, trying to rationalize what I saw. Maybe it was an animal that ran off into the woods when I approached, but it looked too bipedal to be anything other than a person. Why would someone be standing in the middle of an empty road this late at night? Every hair on my body was standing on end, telling me to get out of there as soon as possible. I put my car in gear and started to slowly drive again, keeping my eyes peeled for anything suspicious along the side of the road. About a half-mile down, I spotted something up ahead near the shoulder. It looked like bundles of clothes piled up at the side of the road. As I got closer, I realized with dread that it wasn't just piles of clothes. It was a body. I pulled over and dialed 911 with a shaky hand to report what I found. I did not get out of my car, too terrified of what or who might be nearby in the dark woods. By the time the police arrived, I had worked myself into such a panic that I could barely speak coherently. They searched the area with flashlights while I paced back and forth by my car, glancing fearfully into the thick trees. Finally, an officer approached me. "Sir, I need you to tell me exactly what you saw." I stuttered as I recounted, spotting the figure in the middle of the road, and then finding the body down the road, and then finding the body down the road. "Was the person you almost hit wearing any light-colored clothing by chance?" he asked grimly. My blood ran cold as I remembered the pale blur in my headlights before I swerved. I nodded silently in reply. "We've been searching for a killer who has been preying on travelers on this stretch of lonely back roads. They lure people out of their cars and slaughter them in the woods. It seems you had a very close call with the individual we are hunting tonight. I know this is alarming, but I need you to stay calm. Can you come take a look at something for me?" I trembled but agreed, following him warily into the surrounding woods. He led me a short distance to a grisly scene illuminated by the flashlights of other officers. There, laying partially covered by fallen leaves, were remnants of what used to be a person, dismembered and discarded like trash. I gasped and held back the urge to vomit at the grotesque sight. "Do the articles of clothing on the remains look familiar?" the officer asked gently. I steeled myself and took a cautious look. The colors were hard to discern in the low light, but the fabric looked hauntingly familiar. "That's it," I confirmed shakily. "That's what they were wearing." The officer put a comforting hand on my shoulder. "I know this has been traumatic, but you've helped us identify the killer's latest victim and put together the pattern of their attacks. We're setting up roadblocks and a manhunt as we speak. Why don't you head on home now, but keep your doors locked and don't stop for anyone. We'll be in touch if we have any other questions. I drove away unsteadily, constantly checking my mirrors again, expecting to see headlights materialize behind me at any moment. I was utterly unsettled by my brush with unspeakable evil in those dark woods. What truly horrifies me most now is realizing how close I came to becoming the killer's next discarded piece in that gruesome puzzle laid out on the forest floor. It still sends chills down my spine thinking back on that night and the bone-chilling discovery that followed. I count my lucky stars that I escaped with my life, but I'll never forget those pale eyes I saw gleaming back at me in my headlights, belonging to a monster hiding in the dark,